The English language is full of concepts borrowed from other languages. In fact, most languages have adopted things from other languages they came in contact with, but English in particular has very many borrowed things. 99% of English words are borrowed. The majority was borrowed from the languages of the Anglo-Saxon, Norman, Latin, Celtic, and Viking people. The Viking influenced both our grammar and vocabulary. Did you know that the word knife comes from the Vikings? In addition, much of the simplicity of our language is thanks to the Vikings. Moreover, English is sometimes referred to as a simple German. But who were the Vikings anyways? What did they do, and why were they so influential to English as a language? The Vikings refers to a group of Scandinavian warriors that raided parts of England. Scandinavia is modern-day Norway and Denmark, as shown on the map. The word Viking means one who lurks in the bay, or pirate. The Vikings spoke a language called Old Norse. Old Norse is a North Germanic language, and this is where it is located on the Proto-Indo-European language tree. Descendants of Old Norse are still spoken today. These languages include Icelandic, Faroese, and Norwegian, which are all North Germanic languages. For the most part, the Vikings were hit-and-run attackers, although they eventually colonized parts of Europe. They physically stole things from the people living in the areas they colonized. There are many accounts of Vikings being brutally forceful towards people, but they adopted aspects of their culture such as Christianity. They also repurposed things. For example, they took valuable items from the church, such as a box for a saint's relic that was used by the Vikings as a jewelry casket. This is also one of the ways the Vikings accumulated wealth. But why did the Vikings do so much raiding? You could say the Vikings were prone to become conquerors. In Scandinavia, there were many young sons from good families because of polygamy, and many of them were power-hungry because of primogeniture. So there were a lot of younger brothers from different mothers that needed a way to earn a living and something to do with their lives, so they became explorers. Political exiles, mercenary warriors, and traders were also colonists. They became prosperous from conquering by taking gold and silver from monasteries and taking captive slaves. Another reason the Vikings became invaders is their boat technology. The Vikings had a long history with boats. Not only did each family that could afford a ship had one, but it was common for people to have small boats for leisure. In the 8th century, there was a crucial development of sturdy keels. This picture shows keels from modern boats in blue. Sturdy keels means that the boat is more durable, efficient, and better as a whole. Better ships make it possible for voyages to be longer and more reliable, which helped the Vikings in becoming successful invaders. Another reason they attacked is because they needed farmland. They also had an advantage from improving weather and climate patterns. Seas became calmer and summers became warmer, but more importantly were the changes in the wind. The wind blew west towards England in the spring to conquer, and east towards Scandinavia in the fall to return home. This was quite beneficial to the Vikings, and it got them into an annual conquering cycle.
These raids on the English began in the late 700s and early 800s. The earliest raids were from Norway, but later the Danes were the most prominent raiders. Many Vikings decided not to make the return journey and stay in England. They had lots of big power because of their military strength over the locals, and pretty much could take anything they wanted from the locals they encountered. They had free land, slaves, and resources and food, so it was pretty nice for them. Because England was divided into 7 kingdoms, it was for the most part easy for the Vikings to brush aside the English rulers and take control. However, Wessex, the strongest of the 7 kingdoms, had a standing army, a navy to fight off Viking attacks before they landed, many strongholds where the people could shelter from raiders, and lastly a great ruler, Alfred the Great. Wessex grew in power partly because there was no other strong unified states in England at that time. It reclaimed a lot of land from the Vikings for the English. Eventually, in 878, Alfred the Great created a truce with the most prominent Viking warlord, Guthrum. This defined which half of England belonged to the English and which half belonged to the Vikings. The Viking half in the north was called the Danelaw, after the Danes who ruled it, and the south belonged to the English. This created an environment in which the English-speaking people and the Vikings lived relatively peacefully peacefully together. They exchanged vocabulary with each other, and Viking language had a huge effect on the grammar and vocabulary of the English language.
Some may ask, why did Old Norse have such a profound effect on English vocabulary? And part of it is because the Vikings came on boats and conquered much of England. When they did this, they didn't simply just take what they wanted and leave. As a matter of fact, many stayed and made settlements or tried to integrate into existing societies. And since both Old Norse and English are Germanic languages that were still pretty young, they were quite similar. The similarities made it so it was easier for words to stick in English, as they weren't all that difficult to incorporate because of the grammar. Also, there were many Vikings that settled and occupied places all over England, so there were also many people to help push these words onto English. Finally, because the Vikings and the natives had continuous and prolonged contact, the two languages mixed more and more and continued to become simplified. The reason the Celtic vocabulary didn't drastically affect English is because the Vikings when they invaded, they pushed the Celts out of the area, so their language is no longer influencing English words very much. A lot of the words in English from Old Norse actually originate from place names. There are over 1,500 Scandinavian place names, and many of them are now English words. These place names, being the source of new words, helped ensure that those words stuck around longer because the places where the words came from still existed, and as long as they existed, the words could be reinforced into the language. English takes so many words from other languages that only 1/6 of modern-day English words originate from Old English. Obviously, 5/6 of the words in English aren't from Old Norse, but at least 1,000 are just from Scandinavian place names, and on top of that, there are also other words that have been incorporated into English from Old Norse. Some general things from Old Norse are words that start with kn, like knife, which originated from kniv. Another example is words that start with th, or the th sound, such as there, possessive, which comes from thera. Some more specific examples of words that come from Old Norse are bag, which originate from baggin, and cap, or gap, which originates from gap, which didn't originally mean just any sort of space, but chasm or valley. Some of the words that English takes are actually just borrowed, and so once English has taken the word baggin and turned it into bag, it eventually got re-imported in Norwegian as bag.
Viking influence on the English language was not just limited to vocabulary. The Vikings also completely changed our grammar. Vikings settling in Anglo-Saxon Britain resulted in English actually losing a lot of complicated elements of the language that other languages still have today, such as gender, reflexive verbs, and verb endings. So what are these three things that I just mentioned? Let's start with verb endings. Verb endings are when the last syllable of a verb is changed based on who or what is doing the action. These can be extremely complicated in other languages, but are very simple in English. You just have to add an s to the verb if the verb is being used in the third person. German, for example, is very complicated. I play has a different ending from you play, which has a different ending from he, she, or it plays, and so on. Old English and Old Norse, the Viking language, are very similar, but one major difference is in the verb endings. For example, if you wanted to ask me if I had a horse to sell, you would say hefst du horse to sellen in Old English, and hefer du hross at selja in Old Norse. The words are similar, but the endings are different. Another example can be shown by looking at the verb endings for the verb to deem in both Old English and Old Norse. Again, the roots of the verbs were similar, but the endings were different. Even if the endings were different but the languages were similar, why does it make sense that the endings fell off in modern English? There are a few reasons for this. Because the languages were so similar, Vikings and Anglo-Saxons were able to communicate effectively, so both languages could still be used and both survived. Then, because children heard Vikings and Anglo-Saxons speaking together, they learned a garbled version of the language, and over time the endings started to be used incorrectly. This resulted in more emphasis being placed on the root of the verb, which in turn resulted in the endings wearing away and falling off completely. You can see this happen if you look at the verb endings in dialect of English spoken at different periods of time. If we start with Old English, we can see that it was very complicated. Northumbrian, a dialect of English spoken later, was slightly similar. In Middle English, the S at the end of the endings were off, bringing them closer to what they are today. Finally, in Modern English, the only verb ending left is the S added to a verb when it is used by a third-person pronoun. How do we know that these effects were the result of Viking influence? One of the most telling pieces of evidence comes from the differences between Northern and Southern Middle English. Because the Vikings only colonized Britain in the north, simplification of the language only occurred in the north. If you look at the verb endings in Southern Middle English, you can see that they are still just as complicated as those of Old English. Another example of grammatical details that died out because of the Vikings is gender. This is where each noun has a certain gender attached to it. English is the only Germanic language that does not have gender. In Spanish, for example, the moon is feminine, but the world is masculine. In German, the spoon is feminine, the fork is masculine, and the knife is either neutral or hermaphroditic, depending on which way you choose to think about it. We lost gender for pretty much the same reasons that we lost verb endings. It was a minor grammatical detail, and it declined in importance when the Vikings and Anglo-Saxons lived together, because it was not necessary for communication. Once again, however, it did not disappear as quickly in the South. All the way until the late 1800s, people who lived in rural Dorset, a city in southwest England, spoke in a dialect that still had some remnants of gender. To say the tree is cut down, they would say he's a cut down. But to say the water has dried up, they would say it's a dried up. Their pronoun for tree is he, but their pronoun for water is it.
Reflexive verbs were also dropped from English because of Viking influence. A reflexive verb is a verb that requires use of a reflexive pronoun, such as myself. These are now mostly eliminated from English. A good way to see this is to examine the same sentence in English and German, a language very similar to the one the Vikings would have spoken before English influence. In English, the sentence, I remember the dog, there is no reflexive. However, in German, the same sentence is said as Ich erinnere mich an den Hund. This literally translates to I remember myself on the male because of the pronoun dog. In this case, the verb to remember is reflexive. It is believed that English lost the reflexive during communication with Viking settlers. Both Old English and Viking language had reflexive verbs, but the reflexive pronouns were different and followed complex rules. As Vikings tried to learn English, they would have found reflexive verbs challenging because Viking settlers were not amazing children learning a first language. Therefore, the Vikings and the English eventually both dropped the reflexive verbs altogether to make it easier to communicate. The Vikings were raiders and conquerors who eventually settled down and lived next to the English for a long period of time. They brought lots of new vocabulary that was absorbed into English. Also, they caused a massive amount of simplification to the grammar of English, notably in the verb endings, gender, and reflexive verbs. In all, the Vikings' invasion of England led to huge changes in the English language which have held on to today.